Hi there. We're back from Alaska, and I'm coming to you from my office in Wisconsin, where I want to talk with you about this exceptional book, Tracks by Louise Erdrich, and how it connects to our themes of public theology and race in American religious history. I love this novel. I love everything pretty much Louise Erdrich has written, and encourage you to follow her work, and I hope you've enjoyed reading this novel. A little something different, but certainly a work in public theology, describing the years 1912 to 1919, roughly, with the last little epilogue, closing scene when Lulu comes back to her people in 1924. And one of the things we're working on this semester is, thinking the periodization of American history, and often that history has been told in terms of the wars. Uh, you have this novel set during the years of World War One, and yet very little attention to that dynamic because there was something much more central going on in the life of the Ojibwa, namely the internal tensions that Erdrich describes, the tracks left behind by these ancestors as she imagines them. Just a few observations about this, about why I love this novel. First, note carefully the shifting narrators. It's really important to pay attention to who's speaking because they're very, very different characters. Nanapush, of course, gets the first and the last word, and Nanapush is a trickster figure. That is one of these shape shifting, spiritual, human, animal characters. And for Erdrich, clearly this is her voice in this character more than any. I mean, all of the words are hers, of course, but she really identifies with Nanapush, and also then with Margaret, Nanapush's wife by the end of the novel, and also Nanapush's betrayer. The novel's a novel about the land. And page 4, she highlights that for us. Nanapush is speaking. Our trouble came from living, from liquor and the dollar bill. Nanapush speaking about the Ojibwa. We stumbled toward the government bait, never looking down, never noticing how the land was snatched from under us at every step. So Erdrich announces this theme at the beginning, and then at the end, of course, the land is being taken from Floor and from the people by the Turcot, I don't know, lumber company for which Eli, one of the characters in the novel, goes to work. So Nanapush speaks to Lulu, to his granddaughter, and you have to recognize that the entire book then is an attempt to persuade Lulu to adopt Nanapush's perspective or point of view. Lulu coming back from one of the residential schools to which she had been sent, one of those residential schools that's been much in the news of late because of the violence associated with them. The other narrator, though, Pauline, speaks to readers. And that's important to understand the novel, to recognize that here Erdrich is speaking to, by and large, a Christian audience. She knows that. And the attempt here is to help readers understand something about Christianity through the character of Pauline. And it seems to me that Erdrich is particularly interested in lifting up Christian repression. That is, the Platonic anti body theology that's been such a central part of the history of Christianity, and the consequences of that anti body theology in a masochistic um, and really death dealing fashion. More about that as we get more into the novel. The novel is riddled with the theme of rape and the phenomenon of rape, starting with pages 24 to 28. Um, the rape of Fleur after winning a poker match. Now, this is a visceral scene in its own right, and yet it's also a metaphor for the entire novel and for the entire historical process that Erdrich is talking about. Because the taking of the trees, the owning of the land, is itself an act of sexual violence, as Erdrich imagines it, and especially through the character of Nanapush, and then through the anger of Fleur, who manifests one particular response to that action, to that sexual violence. More about that in a little bit as well. One other thing to note, kind of by way of preliminary um, observations, note how time is kept in two different ways by Erdrich. First, the linear time associated with Christianity, we're so teleologically oriented in many ways. Moving from now to then, from Genesis to Revelation, from beginning to end, from fall 1913 to spring 1914, etc. But also Ojibwa time, which is both circular and linear. So Onaubengisis, crust on the snow sun, covers that same period of time using the language of the earth, of the seasons, the description of the seasons in a distinctive way. In other words, there won't be two crust on the snow sun seasons, but by the very description, we're dealing with winter. Um, so two very different ways of describing time. The one, quite teleological, and the other both circular and linear, as I describe it. Once again, Nanapush and Margaret are tricksters, and those are the two elders whose wisdom and shrewd character, sometimes morally dubious, but nevertheless resilient, Erdrich would like us to identify with. And let me throw this out there as a suggestion or something to mull over. Unless a pastor is a trickster, they won't do well. They won't lead well unless they have that adaptability, that resilience, that attention to the people, to the environment, to the ecosystem, to the congregational dynamic, and the ability to improvise creatively, um, organizing the resources in new ways that can be like an act of magic. Um, and one of those dynamics, those magical dynamics, if you will, is manifest in the character of Margaret, who we discover on page 51 is a rather creative interpreter of Christianity. They're in, she and Nanapush are in the boat and about to go over to Fleur's place. We jumped into the boat, center of the page, which leaked worse than ever and pushed off. The wind blew harsh and heavy circular gusts, and I was hard put. This is Nanapush narrating. I never saw the bailing can move so fast before or since. The old woman made it flash and dip and hardly even broke the rhythm halfway across when she reached into her pocket again, and this time dumped the whole pouch of tobacco into the pounding waves. From then on she alternated between the working of her arms, addressing different Manitous along with the Blessed Virgin and her heart, the sacred bloody lump that the blue-robed woman held in the awful picture Margaret kept nailed to her wall. So that hybridity is one of the things that Erdrich lifts up for us and is characteristic of many accounts of indigenous spirituality. If you think of the classic Lakota narrative, Black Elk Speaks, called by some the Bible of Native Americans, it is clearly a hybrid of Lakota spirituality with the Roman Catholicism that Black Elk also practiced while still holding to traditional indigenous ways. And that kind of hybridity is one of the important and chief characteristics, perhaps, of the kinds of public theology necessary for the 21st century in the United States. The character Pauline, as one of the narrators, we learn a lot about her. It's worth pointing out her sacrificial theology. She didn't call out during the rape of Flore. She did not act to try to stop it, but at least by her implication or innuendo, and this is a little unclear in the text, she may have been the one to push the bar down over the ice house that then led to the death of two of the three rapists. But note how Pauline interprets this action and her own situation on page 66 in the novel. Every night when my arms lowered the beam, it was my will that bore the weight, let it drop into place, not Russell's and not Flore's. For that reason, at the judgment, it would be my soul sacrificed, my poor body turned on the devil's wheel. And yet, despite that future, I was condemned to suffer in this life also. Every night I was witness when the men slapped Flore's mouth, beat her, entered and rode her. I felt all. My shrieks poured from her mouth and my blood from her wounds. In other words, what Erdrich is here doing, I believe, is pointing out how much Pauline, despite being an attractive character on many levels, is herself a victim. Right along with Flore, her identity too, while she's chosen it, is the one offered to her by the system of the colonializing Christianity. Therefore, she takes on the role in the novel of a scavenger. Pages 69 and 189 are places where that role for her becomes manifest. She looks like a bird, and she begins to work as a midwife to death, as a doula, I guess would be one way to describe it, present for suffering. And pages 68 and 69 in the text, we see this. I alone, watching, that is, watching the dying, filled with breath, knew death as a form of grace. And then over on page 69, I had the merciful scavenger's heart. I became devious and wholly, dangerously meek and mild. And then down at the bottom of the page, after she describes what she does to care for the bodies of those who have died, we set them praying into the ground if they were Christians, or if unconverted, along the death road of the old ones with the next pair of shoes. It was no matter to me what happened after life. I didn't care. I accompanied Bernadette, waited for the moment that brought me peace. In other words, Erdrich is here contrasting not just the two narrators, Nanapush and Pauline, but two different ways to incorporate sort of psychological analysis of this, Freudian analysis. There's plenty of Freud throughout this novel. A contrast between the eros of Nanapush and the eros of Ojibwa spirituality and life ways with, and clearly Nanapush, um, with the Thanatos of Christianity, which, as Erdrich describes it, is really a death cult, a frozen death cult, in fact. Ojibwa spirituality, by contrast, is erotic and it's a theology incorporating land, bodies, animals, nature, ancestors, the wind, all integrated, whereas Christianity, again, is this hierarchical, um, ascetic, and sacrificial set of practices. Um, she says it um, quite directly, describing yet another rape, this one of the Virgin Mary. If you read the language on page 95, it's quite shocking to Christian ears at least. But listen to the language. In God's spiritual embrace, she, capital S, and these are now the words of Pauline, a loss more ruthless than we can imagine. She wept, pinned full weight to the earth, known in the brain and known in the flesh, and planted like dirt. She did not want him, capital H, or was thoughtless like Sophie and young, frightened at the touch of his great hand upon her mind. So there's that theme again, in this case, related to the story of the Virgin Mary, interpreted now by Pauline, this Ojibwa convert to Roman Catholicism, as this act of violence, mirroring the kind of violence she herself experienced, internalized as well. And a similar message comes through from Nanapush about the violence of Christianity, even down to something so simple as what Christians sit on in worship. He shows up on a Sunday, which surprises Father Damien, who's a character who reappears in several of these novels, as do many of these characters. So he sits down these benches, and Nanapush says, "Are a hardship for an old man," I complained. "If you'd spread them with soft pine needle cushions, I'd have come before." Father Damien surveyed the rough pews and folded his hands inside the sleeves of his robe. "You must think of their unyielding surfaces as helpful," he offered. "God sometimes enters the soul through the humblest parts of our anatomies if they are sensitized to suffering." Nanapush replies, "A God who enters the rear door, I countered, is no better than a thief." The young helpers, then, he goes on, gathered and followed the priest as he walked to the altar. I tried to adjust my bones, longing for some comfort, trying to not rustle for fear of Margaret's jabbing elbow. The time was long, and you, Lulu, were never much for church. You wiggled like a squirrel, probed my pockets until you found a bit of hard candy and put it in your mouth. Your eyes glazed over, and you dozed. I felt no great presence either, and decided that the old gods were better, the Anishinaabe characters who were not exactly perfect, but at least did not require sitting on hard planks. So there's a satire throughout of Christian ascetic excess, the convert's zeal. Pauline, continues to have clandestine sex, which then leads her to think of her partner as a sea monster, and she kills him. Fleur gets blamed. And underneath all of this is Pauline's quest to be not only Christian, but also to be white. We were divided, she says, as a narrator on page 136 and 137. I was wholly white. So you have this subtle lure constantly cloaked in Christian ascetic piety, which is extraordinarily violent, that Pauline then internalizes as an effort to become white, with all of the associations that go along with white, such as purity and so forth, those stereotypes that are riddled into Christian liturgy, and that's something we will have to talk about as the semester goes on. The satire gets pretty thick at points. There's the wonderful stories when Pauline was trying to practice the discipline of not urinating during the day. And as she puts it, page 150, I strained to make myself into a block of ice. And Nanapush then tells her all kinds of stories about water and hundreds of words for water in Ojibwa. And that particular scene concludes with Pauline back at the convent, where she has now joined. One of her jobs is to break through the ice that forms on the buckets of water in the kitchen in the morning. And so you have this theme of the sort of iciness of Christianity, and this recurs then when she takes on her name at the end of the novel on page 205. Pauline's last word to us is that she's going to be a teacher in one of the boarding schools, and she gets her new name, Leopolda. I tried out the unfamiliar syllables. They fit. They cracked in my ears like a fist through ice. So that's the law, if you want to put it in Lutheran terms anyway. The gospel is Nanapush and Margaret's grace of hope and participation. There's a beautiful meditation on power on page 177 that I will share because of the beauty of its reflections. Bottom of the page, power dies, power goes under and gutters out, ungraspable. It is momentary, quick of flight, and liable to deceive. As soon as you rely on the possession, it is gone. Forget that it ever existed, and it returns. I never made the mistake of thinking that I owned my own strength. That was my secret. And so I never was alone in my failures. I was never to blame entirely when all was lost, when my desperate cures had no effect on the suffering of those I loved. For who can blame a man waiting, the doors open, the windows open, food offered, arms stretched wide? Who can blame him if the visitor does not arrive? So there's this emphasis on grace underneath Nanapush's satire, his erotic banter, his sense of humor, his connection to the land through medicine, and which then makes the end of the novel the theft of the land by Margaret and the consolidation of Nanapush and Margaret onto Cashpaw land rather than Nanapush's land, rather than Floor's land, that much more agonizing. And yet, there's this incredible scene of magical realism where there's this forest that just is felled by Floor. Again, a metaphor here for all kinds of things. And lumbering has been one of the ways that the Menominee and the Ojibwa and other eastern woodlands people that migrated to the west have made a living, along with gambling, which is one of the features of heaven, of the afterlife in many indigenous communities. So the final word then is this hope, this hope in Lulu, the daughter of Floor, to embrace the native ways, even though she has come from the boarding school with all of its violence, with her haircut and everything else, wearing high heels, and yet Nanapush puts his hope that through Lulu. There can become this new generation. There can become an overcoming of the kinds of alienation that separated Lulu from Flor, Flor from Eli, Nanapush from Margaret, that set the Ojibwa against each other. And so the novel is about that turning point in Ojibwa history and in Indigenous history. As we learn from Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, the second decade of the 20th century was probably, down to 1920, was probably the lowest point in terms of most Indigenous communities and their possibility for survival. Since then, there has been a remarkable increase of activism, of awareness, of quest to restore the treaty rights and land rights that were stolen from the First Peoples of North America. I would be remiss if I didn't also point out how timely this novel is in terms of climate change. The human tracks on the land, those vapor trails that we leave of carbon dioxide, are now threatening to suffocate us, to burn us up in a way that we must, as people, as theologians, as congregational leaders, and as public voices, speak out on behalf of the planet. And that was an awkward sentence at the end of this, but a novel with just so much resonance to it. I hope you enjoyed reading it as you also learned from it. We turn after your papers in on the 20th, so a week from today. We turn then to the Black Church and African American Christianity, and again, trying to work on rethinking periodization and understanding our nation's history from diverse points of view beyond the kind of hegemonic narrative of innocence that has been constructed under the guise of objectivity and Christianization. All right, I'll let it be there. Hope you're having a good week, and I hope you have a great rest of this week as well. There are some fine threads of discussion underway already in relationship to the Dunbar Ortiz book, and I trust that your reading response papers combine your reflection on Dunbar Ortiz and Louise Erdrich's book will also be rich and fulfilling learning exercises. I am going to be in Gettysburg for the board meeting that's coming up. I'll say more about exactly the timing of that, but would look forward to seeing if you happen to be on that campus. We'll be in Philadelphia in October, God willing. Peace.